Everyone. I got to know Taskeen, I think, in the late 2018 when we put together a conference paper with Mahar Bali from Egypt and Tanis from Canada, Tanis Morgan from Canada, and the presentation was in Ireland. So there is room for intercontinental collaboration. When I met Taskeen, she was still busy doing her PhD, but of course now she has accomplished that feat at the University of Cambridge. And yes, looking particularly at addressing injustices through MOOCs, which highlighted some of that, the historical injustices and the cultural impositions and economic dependence are still issues that we have to face. So Taskeen, thank you so much for agreeing to share some of your insights around some of your insights, because you have many. We won't be able to fit them all in today, around how we can assist better in online development to be more socially just. So over to you.
Thank you, Cheryl. And just to check, can you see my slides fine?
Yes, we can. I'm just going to switch my video off, but I'll be here to field any questions if there are.
All right, great. Well, thank you for having me. And while everybody's so happy to hear from me, I have to tell you that a lot of my research actually stems from colleagues at UCT and various other designers and academics in the MOOC space in South Africa. So I feel like I'm almost presenting something that's a collective knowledge that has been parceled back to all of you. But yeah, so my research has been, what I'm presenting today is about my PhD research, as well as the last 2 years since I submitted my PhD, that has been shaped by, online initiatives in, due to the pivot online. So that's sort of where I'll be coming from today. But I must say, I do feel like I'm sort of preaching to the choir because, I think I've learned a lot so much from all the academics in the space. And just before I start, I also want to acknowledge my positionality in this work, from my data collection to the university that I've been working in. So just as an Indian South African, almost as an insider and an outsider on the side of the oppressed as well as the side of the oppressor, my identity has always been shaped by these playing these different roles. And so, yeah, I just like to acknowledge that, and forgive me if I say anything that might not be correct, or but yeah, and the other thing that I also want to say is that I'm not a UDL expert, so I'm really going to be interested in hearing back from all of you to see if what I've presented today matches, or if there's any lessons that I can also learn from the UDL context. So, and the last thing is, I always get the question, are the resources going to be shared? That's the #1 question for my presentation. So I will share this deck as well as some resources from my PhD for you guys to have, and we can email that around afterwards. So just to give you a quick run through of what we're going to talk about today. So I'll give you the context of my research and the topic and the research questions. And then I'll spend some time talking about how I've developed this dimensions of human injustice framework and how that's shaped my research and my thinking. And then I'll move on to the 4 layers of my approaches to designing justice-oriented MOOCs. And throughout the session, there'll be different activities that I've embedded into things. So just starting off with the context, my research very much takes into account the historical and the present day injustices. And so this starts, of course, from colonialism and apartheid and how that's embedded inequalities into the South African education system. And then looking at sort of, post 1994, how this then shifted into inequalities that are enforced and exacerbated by neoliberal policies in education, and laying on top of that, not just the socioeconomic side of things, but also the cultural epistemic side, how university spaces can be alienating for Black students, for students of color, and how it can centralize curriculum and pedagogies that are not from our country. And then overlaying this on the other side of my research was looking at the MOOC movement and how different South African universities have joined this movement, and how they are actually contributing to global knowledge base from an African perspective, and bringing in African context into this global education space. And finally, like I mentioned, looking at how online learning can also exacerbate inequalities, especially as we're seeing due to the pivot online in COVID-19. So just to take you through different parts of my research, the main, what I was looking at is two different things: potential MOOC participants who were predominantly actually non-university students, and then looking at MOOC designers and looking at how MOOCs can be designed better to support potential MOOC participants. And in both of these groups, I looked at who are they, and then looked at what are their perspectives about justice with respect to education. So for the potential MOOC participants, I looked at like what their needs, their preferences, and their aspirations were, and also what they understood about the historical injustices as well as the present day injustices that they face. And then on the other side, I looked at MOOC designers, and a core part of my research was looking at the embodied and situatedness of MOOC designers. So how who they are impacts what they design and how they create a course, whether it's their personality, to their socioeconomic background, to their childhood, their lived experiences, how that shapes what they do. As well as moving on to sort of the chapter 8 stuff, which was looking at their different conceptualizations of justice. And just to put that in context, my research happened in about 2016, just when there was a sort of a big conscientization of different lecturers about decolonization and social justice, and particularly with MOOC designers who are more at the cutting edge of research, trying to incorporate these approaches into the courses that they were doing. So in instances that they did, those were the MOOC designers that I focused on. And all of that came, merged together to this final chapter, and that's what I'm presenting today. And the research question that I was looking at is, to what extent do or could MOOCs, particularly in the South African context, support the educational needs, preferences, and aspirations of marginalized South African youth, as well as address their material, cultural, epistemic, political, and geopolitical injustices. And so that's where my presentation kicks off today. Although I use the word MOOCs, that was my research, but in the Q&A and in the discussion, we can also take that and extrapolate that into general course design, to blended learning, to other forms of online course content. And so, yeah, moving on. So, yeah, within the decolonial space, I think at universities, we often start off with looking at curriculum to see, how can we include different authors and different, whether it's different African authors or more female authors. But beyond that, the decolonization of the university has far more aspects. So management and power, disciplinarity, why are departments the way they are, what institutional culture, access, the shaping of staff, the racial dynamics of staff. But then looking, like, even if we had to decolonize all of that, the concept of the university in itself is also founded on quite colonial concepts. So then the next circle above that is looking at the decolonization of education in general, right from early childhood education to informal education to online education. And the last outer circle is looking at decolonization in other sectors, which is land, governance, medical care, the list goes on. The reason why I mention all of this is that we can't really focus on decolonization of the curricula or of the university without looking at the broader aspects. And that's how, fees must fall, things like that intersect. Can a student get good healthcare? How does that impact the education that they can receive? Where are they living? How long does it take them to get to university? How is the government impacting the different rules and regulations? So all of this weeds together to make a bigger story. And just looking at the meaning of decoloniality, it's quite easy to say, decoloniality is about the dismantling of relations of power and conceptions of knowledge. And within South Africa, I think at least in academic spaces, this word has been used a lot. But what I also like to point out is Janssen's different breakdowns of what this can actually mean in practice and how this has manifested. So the first one I just want to point out is Africanization. And this one is the concept of replacing European knowledges by local and indigenous knowledges. And while this gives a space for these local knowledges to be reclaimed, noting that it's not just one local knowledge, but knowledges that come from different tribes, different cultures within that local space, this can also lead to nativism, or it can lead to co-option of these knowledges for national or political agendas. The second one is Afrocentrism, which rather than rejects other knowledges, tries to recenter, for in this case, South African rooted knowledges or African knowledges. And similarly, it also carries the risk of romanticizing local and indigenous knowledges. So, for example, there could be embedded gender injustices in this. And so this is also to say that just because something is local, it doesn't necessarily mean it's infallible, that it is just in its own right. And the third one is looking at knowledge as entanglement. And so this looks at how knowledge is actually entangled and inseparable in a way that it travels across time and it evolves. So it travels across space and it evolves with time. And so you can't really say something is a specific regional holder of knowledge. For example, you could think about how Islamic knowledges have impacted Greek knowledges, how mathematics is shaped by, India and China and different parts around the world. So the problem of this stance is also that, often history is written by the victors, and there you can have that history of evolution of knowledge can be eradicated. So why I'm painting this picture is just to show you that justice isn't one thing. Justice is actually really complicated, and what one person might think of as just, another might not. And so we always have to find that fine line between things. So coming on to the dimensions of human injustice, here basically I've taken two trajectories of social justice discourses. So one is the social justice frameworks. They have predominantly started in the global north, but have over time been shaped by and adapted to more decolonial needs. So initially they started off with, mainly looking at redistribution, but now recentering representation and things like that. On the other side, you have decoloniality, which did predominantly start from global south researchers, but often didn't touch so much on material injustices. So it focused more on the epistemic injustices, which can be quite academic and theoretical. And so these are the three spheres that I look at in my research. So material injustices, looking at the causes of resource, infrastructural, geographical, and socioeconomic inequalities that have stemmed from, these human hierarchies. Then looking at cultural epistemic injustices, looking at conceptions of knowledge and how different histories, values, and narratives and worldviews have been, marginalized or promoted. And then looking at geopolitical injustices, and particularly relations of power between race, class, sexuality, gender, geographic, spiritual, and linguistic hierarchies. Now, when it comes to MOOCs, what do I actually mean when I say a justice-oriented MOOC? Well, this is part of the problem that I try to understand. So first, you could get MOOCs that actually perpetuate injustices. So this could be MOOCs that, for example, give historical narratives that exclude certain types of histories and viewpoints, whether they've done intentionally or inadvertently. Then you have MOOCs that are based on open philosophies, and open is often understood as something, good, but it's not necessarily just. So this could be a MOOC that's been designed using openly licensed material and software, but it might not actually seek to actively remove cultural, technological, or linguistic barriers. And the third category is MOOCs that strive for justice, but they might not actually reach the marginalized groups, so incorporate marginalized groups into it. So example of this could be a MOOC that's designed to support journalists or activists, or even engineers in designing more sustainable projects, but is not actually reaching, the everyday person that might not be able to access this type of knowledge. The last one is the justice-orientated MOOCs that include marginalized voices and groups and knowledges through removing barriers to access. So this could be a MOOC that, for example, focuses on inclusive education in low resource contexts, so allowing them to access it. So now, just to take you through the three core arguments, the first one I've already mentioned is that there's no one size fits all to justice-orientated MOOCs. You'll need different approaches to achieve different aims. The second one is that the MOOC designers need to examine their subjectivities and how this shapes the epistemological framing of MOOCs from its conceptualization. So what you include, what you don't, who you include, who you don't, is very much a group of MOOC designers that decide this. And when I say designers, I mean the instructional designers, the people who make the graphics, the lecturer who's sort of the expert in this, that whole range. Everybody in the room today is a MOOC, it takes the form of a MOOC designer in their own regard. And the last one is looking at the factors outside of the construction of the MOOC curriculum. So beyond what we look at in assessment, process, and pedagogy, to look at the situated learning, emphasizing, for example, the social, political, environmental, and technological context that designers and participants are embedded in. So just emphasizing that point a bit more, in my approaches to designing justice-oriented MOOCs, I have 4 different layers. So the first one is about framing the MOOC production, and I'm not going to talk too much about that one today. The next is about conceptualizing the MOOC, and this is, in that design phase, in that point of, hey, let's have a MOOC on this topic, that level. Then situating the MOOC is when you're designing it, what are you considering, who are you considering it for? And the last part is constructing and implementing the MOOC. And this, I think, is where the UDL principles fall in, as well as within situating the MOOC. So looking at pedagogies and content and activities and assessment, but also outlining power dynamics within that space. So I think the first part was the MOOC designers. So I'm just going to rush through this because I have mentioned it. Basically, the more epistemically diverse the people are who are at the decision-making table, the more inclusive a MOOC could be. And as I mentioned in my research, the identity of the MOOC designers shapes so much of the ethos and the purpose of the MOOC. For example, a MOOC, one of UCT MOOCs is about archaeology, and that could have been a very serious high-level MOOC, but the MOOC designers sought to make this a MOOC about, making science accessible to the common person, not needing a high level of background to be able to access it. Then the next is about, in this MOOC designer space, one person might not have all the knowledge or all the perspectives. So trying to incorporate different collaborators, experts, teaching assistants, students to take part in this formulation phase of the MOOC. And the third one is partnerships. So working with different voices, and most importantly, voices beyond the academic space to make sure that the MOOC is quite relevant, practical, and grounded. Now, here I've looked at MOOCs in 3 different aspects. So justice as content. Now, this is when different MOOC designers have attempted to include a diversity of authors and reading lists and that sort of thing to incorporate different perspectives. This sort of angle works when a specific region or a specific topic is the focus. But it might not work if, for example, you're doing a global MOOC where there's so many different cultures at the table that you can't, or regions that you can't focus one without that focus actually being exclusionary. And that's where justice as pedagogy comes in, where you can use the pedagogies to create interactivity and co-creation of knowledge within the learning space to promote critical thinking between participants and between different forms of thinking and regions. And so that sharing can happen. The third one is about justice as process. And here, it's not just about because what I noticed in some of the MOOCs I reviewed is that the pedagogy in the course was very different towards the process in designing the course. So making sure that you have a diversity of stakeholders, including students from the get-go in different aspects of the design process. And here, just for example, I've mentioned the first one in terms of having different justice-oriented purposes. And within MOOCs that were justice-orientated, they focused on people and communities. And so the first example I mentioned was about the communication of science to the broad lay audience. The other example was from Luyiso, whose purpose of his MOOC was to get many thinkers and writers and poets and artists who have never been taught, highlighting their voices in the MOOC. Another one was from Nene, to get the stories out of teachers who are doing a lot with the very little that they had. And for Richard, his target audience was more looking at senior members on government and to seeing how they could use evidence to support their decision making. So people and looking at the target audience is quite important in research. Now, another aspect is looking at the philosophical underpinnings of MOOC designers and making them explicit. So what are the underlying philosophical assumptions that MOOC designers have, and how does this impact their MOOC? What agendas are they promoting or countering? What schools of thought in philosophy or in science, in education, you have the behavioralists or the Freireans. What school of thought are you pushing forward in this MOOC? And how do these epistemological assumptions impact how learning happens? So for example, an agenda, and just moving on to the next slide, on agenda, it might be that you want to promote inclusive education as opposed to special needs, right? So that doesn't mean, as opposed to specific special needs schools. And this is, I think Judith is in the room, one of the main goals of the education for all courses. So agenda doesn't mean a negative thing. I have an agenda right now when I'm presenting this, but making that explicit. So once you have a stance, that means that there are other stances that you're not taking. So it doesn't mean don't have a stance, and it's almost about countering the idea that everything is neutral and objective. So here I wanted to maybe take a minute and maybe one or two of you could say, think about a course that you've recently designed or a course that you've participated in, and think of how that course would have been delivered differently if the designer had been different, if a different person had designed that course. And the second question is, were they, if they're just thinking about this course, were there different agendas being promoted and counted? And they might not have made this explicit, but after hearing this, you might think a bit more. So I wonder if does anyone want to contribute, one or two thoughts? Don't all jump at once. And maybe someone from the SILT team who has designed a course. Luna, you want to jump in?
Hi, yes, thank you. I want to speak on from the perspective of a course that I suppose tutored on. I think if the course had been designed differently, there would have been more sensitivity towards, the online learning environment, the more sensitivity towards the PDL context, the physically distance learning context for those outside of UCT. And then also in terms of were there any particular agendas promoted? thinking back, I think it was definitely there was a sort of hidden agenda, and that is biased towards a particular researcher in that course.
Thanks so much, Lena. And Alison?
Yes, I've actually just been involved in designing a small course on academic integrity. And for me, it was very, very important. I was very aware of, in a way, that it's not helpful to be the expert in this, and almost to throw it back to the class, to be setting a community culture, and therefore to get the voices, you know, much more than what the rules are and what my perspective or the expert's view is, but to get the input, to get the discourse going around it, and from that set something in motion which wouldn't be finished immediately after that module. It would continue through the degree. So it's interesting it's wonderful to hear you saying this, and it so much correlates with my experience of that process.
Yeah, and that's really one of the best ways to address injustices in a course, because if you're learning from the room, if you're learning from the people, and it's not just this unidirectional, I'm the expert and I know, that can definitely address the injustices. Thanks, Alison.
I did think afterwards that I probably should have been more assertive and given a few more definitions, but even so, I thought, no, it was the right way to start. You know, but I could see that why people would like to put the authoritative stamp. but it achieves something different, as you say.
Yeah, and you know, just saying that there's a specific word why I use like towards justice orientated MOOCs, because there's no end goal. There's not like this is just and this is not. So every time you do something, I think we all do that. Every time you run a course, it's something you want to do differently. So I think that's great that you're learning out loud about your experiences. Bedad?
I'm just thinking about this. I recently designed a course, it's called Child Health or Pediatrics, which is a module in the PGDUP emergency care course. And having worked on various TEDI courses that Judith Mackenzie was the lead on, I learned about, you know, social justice, about children's rights, the need to include different voices and so forth. So obviously I came with that, and I worked with a new academic team. So I'm thinking if it was a different learning designer that perhaps, you know, had different experiences, how would the child health course be? Because there were many moments where, you know, I raised questions about how can we include the South African child in here, and not just, you know, a child from Europe or a child seen from the Western world. And I worked with white colleagues, and I think my voice in this regard as a learning designer that questioned that and challenged them a bit was needed. You know, else, you know, looking at the second point, were any particular agendas, whether hidden or explicit, being promoted or counted? Perhaps, you know, the South African child or the African child would be left out or viewed in a very Eurocentric or Western way, because they did try very hard to include the African child, but it was in a different way, you know. They looked at the child in a different way that I look at the child in a different way. And it was important to include both our views in that situation.
Yeah, and the point you touch on there is also so important in trying to make something, especially with MOOCs, when trying to make something global so that it's applicable to all. That means that it might be less locally relevant, and it might just be, you know, looking at that content, justice as content sort of thing. If you're designing a purely South African course, it's going to look very different from one that you're trying to reach globally. So yeah, it's quite difficult to strike that balance, and knowing who the target group is does shape that. I'm gonna move on to the next slide because I'm very over time in my own schedule. So here is looking at the different target groups when I reviewed MOOCs. And some of these stem off Laura Suzanovitz's work as well. So looking at, when you design a course, who is it for? And so it could be marginalized groups, it could be, and then again, I often say that word marginalized, but what does that mean? It means very, very different things in different contexts. It could be about refugee support, it could be about, socioeconomically disadvantaged learners, could be race, gender, ethnicities. Then looking at different stages of students, so undergrads versus grads versus professionals. So here I just sort of laid out the different types of things to think about how you would tailor something for a different target group. Now, just another activity here is, what are some of the different contextual factors that you think about when designing for a diverse target group? So maybe you can just type some, like if everyone can just type something in the chat when you think of your target group and all the differences in it, what diverse factors do you think of? Like, for example, differing age or differing genders. So do you guys want to pop into the chat? I don't even know if I can see the chat right now. Let me go back.
Okay. I can see the chat and I can report back if you need to.
Okay, I can see it. So
okay.
And you can just start with like differing XYZ into the chat. Okay, past learning experiences, languages, different disabilities, ability with computers, internet access, demographic, work experience, that's a nice one, digital schooling backgrounds. Yeah, these are really great options. And I think there's some new ones that I haven't even thought of. So once again, I'm learning from all of you. Home backgrounds. So here I've highlighted some. Culture, learning behaviors. I really like the learning behaviors one. That's quite important. Tech challenges, home languages. So, okay, so here's some that I highlighted, and it's great that I think you're all thinking of along the same lines as I have. Like, not just like, I think when people think of diverse, especially when I know the education and inclusive education movement has tried to push beyond just thinking of like learners with disabilities needing, different support to a wide range of things. So just also thinking about the situation that your participants are in. So for example, do they have family responsibilities, financial responsibilities that will impact how much time they have to learn? Flexibility, the ability to use online learning platforms, different political views. So if, when we say local, it's not one thing, right? We know in South Africa, we have a wide range of political views on things, and how do we incorporate that? And how do we also create room for this, productive and healthy discussion and debate between different viewpoints? So yeah, just wanted to point that out. And just once again, all of this is just about making things explicit so that we think about, for example, I don't know if you look at family responsibilities when you're thinking about your participant and what time they'll be able to access a course. All right, so moving on. Now I'm onto the sort of the next sphere of the research, which is situating the MOOC, and here looking at different technological accessibility. So when designing from a technical side of things, some of the lessons learned from the different courses was about looking at mobile compatibility. So ensuring that there is, what is it? I forgot the term now, reactive design, or that adapts to different mobiles, making sure that any videos are kept short so that they can be downloaded easily, ensuring that you have transcripts and subtitles to support, and caption hovering over text to describe captions for visually impaired learners. Then having things that are downloadable and offline. So this also, it's not just about having offline to use it, but also because then others can reuse that content, for example, to add their own transcriptions or translations onto something. The last one about WhatsApp groups was really important. In the different MOOCs that we looked at, the online official discussion groups often weren't used as much as when informal WhatsApp groups were created. And this has also in my last 2 years has also been something that's emerged. So WhatsApp is something that people are comfortable with. They know how, most people, even if they don't have a lot of digital literacy skills, can use WhatsApp quite well and are comfortable with it. So using a platform that people are already comfortable with to encourage discussion is much more useful than a formal discussion board where they feel like they're being observed or monitored or they can't express themselves. Then the next one is situating in terms of the learning environment. So often when we look at justice or distributive principles, we think about distribution of materials, but it's also about supporting people to access and uptake and use those materials to benefit them. So this needs to go beyond providing resources and also ensuring that support is given. And so within online spaces, the support needs to be given to show how to use and navigate around a platform, add different signposting. So, you know, click here. In the research that I was doing, some students were just stuck on a course because they couldn't understand that a specific button or icon meant move next, right? You have to actually say, like, click the blue button to move to the next section, something like clear signposting in this. And then also designing multiple pathways around the course, but also to accommodate different levels of participants. And here's a screenshot from Education for All, which this concept was explained quite well, because they had different articles on how to use FutureLearn and how to use the course, which was really useful. It wasn't assumed that everybody's used this platform before. The next thing is about centering being human. So in online virtual spaces, and we've all experienced this in COVID now, you feel alone, you can feel unconnected. And so you have to make extra concerted and explicit effort to create a shared space, to create, comfort and friendliness between participants. So one strategy that was quite useful in a MOOC, and I'm wondering how this could translate into other courses, but in asking someone to invite a friend that they know to do the course with them, because otherwise you get lonely, you don't know who to lean on. And so if you have a friend that you already know doing the course with you, that can be supportive. And then also leaning on the MOOC designers to create that atmosphere of warmth and from, being personable. So very much the character of the MOOC designers and the presenters come across here. Having teaching assistants is also quite useful, because in online and blended learning courses, there's much more support, not just on the technical side, but also on the pedagogical side to create discussions. You're not there face to face with someone, so you need more support to encourage this. And then having support for designer training, and here again, translating this to broader blended learning course design, is having proper design for all lecturers on how to create an online course. The lecturers are experts in their subject, but they might not be experts in digital pedagogies or openness. So bringing these skills is really important for lecturers and course designers to have the skills. And yeah, even course designers also need support at the technical side of these things. So ensuring that they are well supported. Now, the next part is about now into that final inner bubble where I think UDL overlaps the most, is about the creating and implementing part. So there's different pedagogies that you can use. And often we do, like in more activist spaces, we push for a liberationist approach, for pushing critical consciousness and, pedagogies that challenge, relations of power. But I wanted to show a full set here, because at different points in a course, or in different courses and different points in a course, you might want to use different pedagogies. So the first one is instructivist approaches, and this is more of the, this approach, a sort of delivery content approach, where you're teaching something and somebody is then receiving that, and it's understood, or it's sort of like there's one right answer, and you're assessing whether the student has understood that correctly. The second is about cognitive constructivist approaches, and this is when learners can construct their own knowledges, but this is done independently. So them working through their own scaffolded learning approaches, and this can use action-based or inquiry-based learning. The third one is social constructivist, is when you learn together through interaction with others, as well as with interaction with the environment. So this would be experience sharing or collaboration or social learning. Then you have Socratic processes, which is about this questioning approach to unravel and discover the truth. And and there's different stances to this, whether there's one truth or whether you're still investigating something. And there could be many truths, but using that inquirer interlocutor approach. So someone, like I think Alison said, you could be the expert in the room, but you don't provide the answer. You use this dialectical process for the learner to come to the answer themselves. Then there's the liberationist approach, which is about gaining a critical consciousness and using reflective processes. Here is almost about changing the system, trying to encourage learners to think out the box. And the last one is about connectivist approaches, which is learning through your social network. So going beyond the borders of the classroom to looking at websites and Twitter and blogs, to create, to learn from your broader space. And actually Cheryl and I are a great example of that, who, came together through almost social network and colleagues to put together something. So here, I don't know if we have time for a big discussion, but I wonder if there's, these different pedagogical approaches. Does anyone have any specific thoughts on like a specific way they could be used in an activity or a topic or a lesson? Any reflections from what I've just presented? And I'll go back to the previous slides so you can see them clearly. Feel free to speak up or put your hand up. Like, when would you think one of these is particularly useful, or when would you think it would not be the most appropriate response? Or when have you seen the wrong approach used somewhere? Maybe just one person, and then we can move on.
Well, I can give an example here of having a course that was presented by one person on collaborative work. And they didn't see the internal tension.
The irony, yeah. Yeah.
So that was one where, and even though I tried to explain it, they didn't see it.
Yeah, that's useful. So let me jump to my example. I reviewed 3 different MOOCs or courses that were all focused on sort of, again, it was in this time of Roads Must Fall and looking at decolonial discourses. And I looked at 3 different courses, and although all of them had the same sort of purpose, it was really interesting how different they manifested. So if you look at course B versus A, so A was mandated by the university. It was, I think, some decision that the university had that, okay, we're going to do this course on to showcase more African work. And course B was more student-led, right? So although they had the same topic, course A did a very content-focused one. They went and looked at all the scholars and philosophers, and they made reading lists to incorporate this into it, and they used a very automated assessment to do this. And it didn't have much co-creation in the design phase, whereas the second one, B, really was a student-led movement, and they interviewed different students, they added their reflections, they added other aspects that weren't part of literature, African spirituality, looking at politics, looking at Pan-African thought. So they had, it was a much more process-driven approach. And although this course, it didn't have the sort of funding and the backing to make it as popular as the other course, it really had that process in it. However, because it didn't have the funding, it couldn't create, great videos and things like that. So they would rely more on podcasts. And the last one was interesting as well, because the designer, the lecturer, encouraged very critical thinking, that Socratic approach in the pedagogy, but it was still sort of the sage on the stage. That expert still held the space, and there wasn't much co-creation in the development of the MOOC and deciding what the topic was going to be about. So here's just a clear example of very similar topics, but how they materialize very differently. So jumping onto the next part and emphasizing this point of co-creation, participation is really important. So how do you encourage this in it? So I mentioned the discussion forums, but also moving beyond discussion forums to looking at like WhatsApp groups and things like that. And using this discussion forum to have thought-provoking questions to encourage discussion, not just what often happens in MOOC platforms is like single comments where you're sort of shouting out into a room and nobody's responding to you. Another useful tactic that I learned from one of the UCT MOOCs as well was about Q&A sessions. So having mini podcasts for people, they can either submit their questions in written form and then addressing these questions. So beyond the formal part of the course is having these Q&A sessions built into it. And podcasts were particularly used because they're not data intensive. So just having audio only and something that's quick and fast for the lecturer to do every week. Facebook, WhatsApp groups, in-person learning groups. These are all different types of ways to encourage participation. The next one is about looking at content. So here, looking at, from images to videos, podcasts, reading material, having diversity of types of content helps to support different learners in what their preferences are and the ways that they like to learn, but also the types of content. So is it expert knowledge? Is it theories? Is it skills? Looking like, could you promote scenario-based learning? Throwing current affairs into the mix, maybe you need to talk about Chris Rock and Will Smith and gender and bring that into the conversation to make it relevant to the students. Using provocations, putting out a challenge and seeing if people would agree or disagree, and then incorporating personal stories. So these are different ways that you can make content more interesting and more diverse. So yeah, in terms of best practices, moving away from like just recording a talking head, which is what I am right now, and looking at like, okay, well, if you're using video in something, how can you do a site location? How can you show different objects and facets that you wouldn't be able? How can you take this beyond what a face-to-face class would be to show different aspects? Go into a surgery, look at different equipment, look at infrastructure. Then using charts and infographics, varying the type of presenters. So not just having that expert, but having even students be presenters, take over a class, having practitioners. As academics, we often hold a space where there's so much to learn from practitioners themselves. And then the last point, I think it actually links to what Vidad was saying earlier. So in a lot of the MOOCs, Africanness was mentioned, but it was often the selling point to the global education base. And what that did is that although it challenged cultural epistemic injustices, and it showed like, here we are Africans and we have something to contribute to the global knowledge base, it often didn't do enough to include the marginalized groups within South Africa. So to address the material injustices. So if we chose languages, it might have been like French, but you could have like Hausa, or you could have even isiZulu or something that's more local to have access. So those two, there's often a tension between those two angles. So just doing a time check, what is it? So we have 8 minutes. So I did have a little Jamboard exercise. And I'm wondering if it's still useful. Cheryl, do you think we should do this, or maybe use the last minute to just have open discussion?
I think we should use the last few minutes for questions from the group. We've got such a wealth of experience here. I would love to hear how people are relating what they've heard from you to their contexts.
All right, that sounds great. So let's merge the Q&A, and also it's kind of similar to the question based on the presentation today and your role and positionality in the whole process. What would you do to make your course more justice orientated? So either respond to that or ask a question, or let's have a discussion around that. Judith, this is yeah, one of my gurus, one of the main sources of knowledge for this. So really nice to see you again, Judith.
Thank you, Taskeen. That's very kind of you. It's been absolutely that is entirely neutral, because I've learned so much today. I really have enjoyed it so much. It's so comprehensive what you've shared with us. But you started off saying that you didn't know much about universal design for learning and UDL. And it's one of the things that we're finding again and again as we work with this project, is that people are really using the strategies are similar, and the UDL is just a framework to place these strategies within. So, for example, when you're talking about placing difference at the center, you talked about all the whole concept of UDL is to start planning for difference, not start planning for you plan with diversity in mind. And then, your discussion of the technological accessibility, the learning support, and even that aspect of being human. I wonder, it would be such an interesting discussion to say, okay, how, if we were to take your considerations for a justice-orientated MOOC and package it in a UDL framework, I'm wondering, would it help us? And I ask this as an open question, would it actually help, or are we doing the same thing again? So it really made me think, like, how do we take what people are doing that is so orientated towards difference, towards educational equity, and how do we, can UDL help to just frame it and organize it so that it is comprehensive when we make these considerations. So thanks very much. I just think it's interesting that there's so much that we would be thinking of in UDL.
Thanks, Judith.
Thank you.
And I actually thought about that. I quickly looked, I mean, I have worked in UDL a little bit, but I wouldn't say I'm an expert. But I think the main parts that overlap is the situating the MOOC, when you look at the the learner's context and the MOOC designer's context and things. The part that I think it's almost at the conceptualizing phase. So the epistemic levels are the parts that are not yet in UDL, is my understanding, but you could correct me if I'm wrong. So questioning your philosophical underpinnings, and that layer there is the one that's still not in there. But coming to the learner and the design part. So I think conceptualizing is almost pre-design, and UDL starts off with the design angles, so the two inner circles.
I think there is just a little comment. I think it is a bit of a move now to start to think about those aspects as well, and acknowledging the absence of that foundation in universal design for learning. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Taskeen, go ahead, Lauren. I see Lauren's hand is up.
You're welcome to go without.
Okay, I'll just be very quick. I just wanted to say, for me, I think it's important to have a diverse course team to work on a project, so that there are different views, we can share, challenge, not just people from like, okay, this is a project, all people are white, all people are the same, race and stuff. There should be different voices, and I think that's important.
Yes, and definitely agree. And just to add to that, it's also not just about white, but whiteness, because especially like I think we're not just like dated in terms of the color of our skin, but also conditioned to think in white ways. So I think I myself, as a brown Muslim, Indian woman, have had very white thinking, and white in the sense of colonial thinking. So I think that it's a duty upon all of us all of us to critique the coloniality in our thinking.
Excellent. Thanks for that reminder, Taskeen.
Yeah. Lauren.
Hi, Taskeen. So I'm a learning designer at SOAP as well, and I think everything that you've presented here will kind of apply to general learning design, not just MOOC design.
Yeah.
So it's lovely to see all of this, and thank you. It's great work. What I'm struggling with is it requires quite deep reflection and looking at things from different angles, and all of that is necessary. So what I have trouble with is balancing that with working according to a timeline when you are creating a course, when you are producing a course, and how to balance that. I don't, if anyone can answer me this, I will be very grateful.
Yeah. You know, that was the exact point we had. I work for EdTech Hub, and yesterday we had a workshop on a similar thing, like looking at how we can bring more co-creative practices into what we do and the research we do. And everybody says, but it's not budgeted for in the time, right? And then that's exactly what you need to do. Create an entire phase, which is about, reflecting, conceptualizing, working together. Because if you don't do that and you rush into something, then you skip over. So I think it comes down to the funding and the budgeting and the planning as well.
Yes, yes, I love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Perhaps we can sneak in one more question. Shanali.
Cheryl. Taskeen, this kind of is a riff off Lauren's question, and it's not quite so much about time, but it is about burden of labor. So one of the things that I struggle with, I teach on a PG Dip course with Daniela, and Luna, who was in the room earlier, audited the course, and Widad has been on the course, and Cheryl has previously taught on the course. One of the things that we've been struggling with in trying to bring increasing opportunities for student involvement into the design of the course is that it also adds an additional burden.
To the student, you mean?
To the student.
Yeah.
Not to the staff member. In some ways, it relieves some of the burden because you no longer have to hold that whole process. But how do we balance ideas like co-construction with adding burdens to students who are already juggling many things?
I mean, for the first thing, I think definitely students' time should be remunerated if they're actually helping to do something. And it might be something like course credits. It doesn't have to be monetary, or being listed as co-authors in something. So it shouldn't be extractive when they support. And it could be just like design workshops, so having them come together for an afternoon to do something. But I think it's a very important point, the labor that this could bring on, whether students or just people of color that always have to pick up and be that person that goes, but you put a hand up and raise the counter argument. There's a lot of emotional labor in that as well. So I think, we do need to be sensitive around those aspects.
Well, we could carry on talking to you all afternoon, Taskeen. I think there are so many points of resonance, but people do need to move on to other things. And so I just want to say on behalf of the group here, thank you so much for taking time out to be with us. And I think you've presented, I think Judy said, a very comprehensive view. And I think there are things that people perhaps have thought, but they just haven't grouped them quite in that way before, which I think was particularly helpful. So I don't know if there's somebody else in the room, just one person who would like to say a verbal thank you, somebody perhaps we haven't heard from this afternoon, and then we'll close off. So somebody who's perhaps not from UCT. Michelle saying thank you, and Judith saying thank you in the chat. And Lauren.
Thank you, everybody. It's been lovely.
Okay.
And I definitely love to connect more on any of the projects that you're working on. You've mentioned some in the chat. That'll be great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, and thanks, Taskeen.
Thank
Bye
you,
for now, everyone.
Taskeen. Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time.